What if the person you gave your whole heart to walked away only to come back begging for another chance? Would you let them in or finally set yourself free? Today on Cheating Stories 7, we bring you a heartbreaking and powerful story. She left me broken, then begged to return. My revenge was freedom. It's a journey through betrayal, pain, and the ultimate discovery that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't anger but freedom itself. So stay until the end, because the twist in this story will make you question what true love and true revenge really mean. And before we begin, don't forget to support Cheating Stories 7 with a like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us bring more stories like this straight to you. Now, let's step into the story. They married in a courthouse that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper, a place where love seemed small but determined. After the vows, they celebrated with grocery store cupcakes eaten on the trunk of Mark's car. The photos were out of focus, all teeth and sky, as if the universe had chosen joy over clarity. For months afterward, they called their first apartment the Good Shoebox. Morning light pooled on the scuffed hardwood like something alive. The kitchen had one drawer that stuck and a window that framed the fire escape as though it were art. At 6 every morning, Mark ground coffee by hand while Emily read the headlines aloud in a sleepy voice. They kept a shared grocery list on the fridge, each scribble a promise of ordinary life together. Slowly, they learned the muscle memory of each other's contradictions. Her love of silence against his habit of narrating, his neatness against her small chaos of scarves and notes. On Sundays, they walked past starter homes painted in cheerful colors, pointing and laughing, guessing which one would someday carry their names on the mailbox. Little fissures began as excuses that made sense. Emily was tired. Work was heavy. The rain made everything slow. She slept in, sometimes until noon. She stared at the ceiling as if a message might arrive there if she waited long enough. Mark told himself the shine wears off every honeymoon. The real story begins after that. So he loaded the dishwasher, folded laundry, and paid the bills for now, because seasons pass and surely this one would too. Intimacy thinned like a sweater washed one time too many. They still touched, but the touches were careful, negotiated. Conversation narrowed into logistics, rent, work schedules, whose turn it was to grab paper towels. When Emily finally said, "I feel numb," it landed like a fact rather than a confession. Mark went to the bookstore and came home with paper answers: sleep hygiene, food mood, the hormone ladder. He laced his shoes and walked with her at dusk, counting steps as though rhythm could coax feeling back. He listened until his throat burned, because listening felt like the one tool that could not be wrong. He told no one how lonely he was. Praise from friends, that they were steady, that they made it look easy, settled on him like duty. Steady people do not complain. Steady people keep promises until the promises keep them. He began to take pride in endurance, not noticing that pride is a poor substitute for relief. Winter pressed its face to the glass. In the early dark, the apartment became a study in subtraction. There was less laughter, fewer plans, a shrinking supply of firsts. Emily's days were organized around simply getting through. She was not cruel. She was absent with the gentleness of snow, blanketing everything, soundless and complete. Mark learned to read the quiet, how the angle of her shoulder under the blanket meant not today, how the way she breathed meant do not ask. He did not ask. What he did was work. He worked for pay, then worked for hope. He set timers for dinner and timers for laundry, even timers for vitamins a blog had promised would help. He became efficient the way emergency rooms are efficient. Triage first, future later. He told himself he was building a bridge, when really he was building a routine that required no one to change. When she finally cried without words one night, he held her and said the sentence he thought made him brave. "I will not leave you alone with this." He meant it. He believed loyalty could outlast anything. He did not yet understand how darkness can colonize not just a person but a home, how it can teach the floorboards to groan differently, how it can make a vow feel like a leash no one intended to buckle. February brought a thaw that fooled the trees. On a bright fall spring afternoon, they toured an open house they could not afford and laughed at the closet that was somehow also a half-bath. For an hour, he saw a version of their future in which this was a rough chapter they would someday joke about. He bought her a croissant and tucked the receipt into his wallet like a ticket stub from a movie he hoped would end well. That night, she slept 13 hours and woke up tired. Mark did the math without moving his lips. He was 27. He had spent the first year of marriage trying to be equal parts husband and lighthouse. He believed marriage was a craft and crafts take patience. He mistook patience for stasis. He repeated his private catechism, "This will pass, she will return, we will return," and failed to notice that he had stopped being part of the we and started being the keeper of it. When he looked at their good shoebox, he could still see love in the way their coats leaned together on a single hook. What he could not see was the cost creeping in, charging by the month and collected in years he would never get back. He went to bed promising himself that tomorrow he would ask for a different kind of help, one that included him in the solution. But in the morning, he made coffee at 6 and did not ask. The day was already full. He told himself there would be time. The cracks that once looked like tired excuses soon widened into something heavier. A referral came folded in thirds, a clean white slip with a name and address and the fragile promise that maybe someone else would know what to do. The doctor had recommended therapy. For a moment the word offered relief, like a door opening to a room filled with chairs and answers. But almost instantly it also offered work. Emily scheduled Tuesdays at 4. She went. She came back. And yet, the world inside their apartment stayed dim. Mark stretched himself to fill the gaps that no prescription and no appointment seemed to touch. He left early to beat traffic, stayed late to secure his pay, and still managed groceries, laundry, and the delicate diplomacy of shared space. He learned how the dishwasher wanted to be loaded for maximum quiet. He made soup on nights when she couldn't handle the texture of solid food. He added his name to every bill because due dates slipped past her gaze. He taped a calendar to the pantry door and filled it with reminders like spells. The house did not suddenly brighten. It simply refused to dissolve. A 40-hour week became 60 when he got home. He moved as if motion alone could hold the walls upright. Beers with Tom vanished because beers meant 2 hours and 2 hours meant guilt. Saturday runs disappeared because the treadmill of the week had already drained him. At night, he slept on the far edge of the bed, careful not to wake her, resentful of his own carefulness. He watched the numbers on the clock find their stubborn rhythm, 1:13, 1:47, 2:02. Silence was heavier than shouting. When Emily spoke, it was often to catalog the ways she was failing. She was sorry she could not cook, sorry she could not smile, sorry she did not know why she could not do either. Mark's mouth learned 2 automatic sentences. "It isn't your fault," and "we will find a way." He meant both, but each chipped at him differently. The first shook his belief in cause and effect. The second hovered like breath on a cold day, visible but gone too soon. Days stacked like identical bricks. Work, mess, dinner, dishes, collapse. He mapped the week by the recycling bin, measured time by the dust on the TV stand. The apartment still carried the name they once gave it, the good shoebox. But it no longer felt like theirs. It was a stage set where only one actor remembered his lines. Family pictures still smiled from the walls, their frozen faces mocking the silence. Mark avoided the photo with the courthouse and the cupcakes. It looked now like a prank pulled by 2 optimistic strangers. He wondered if love was supposed to feel like erasure. He didn't dare say the word aloud. He didn't Google it yet. Instead, he searched for tiny victories he could count. A load of towels dried before midnight, an empty sink. 20 minutes of conversation that didn't collapse under the weight of tears. He tracked the way her therapist's name, Dr. Carter, appeared in sentences. "He thinks I should journal. He says sunlight matters. He says it's not you." Each phrase carried both hope and postponement, equal parts promise and delay. Mark nodded, absorbed it, and set the table anyway. At 2 a.m., When the apartment had become a museum of dim shapes, he scrolled under the covers. Supporting a depressed spouse. How to help without losing yourself. How to ask for help without making it worse. Advice was plentiful and contradictory. Be patient, set boundaries, speak up, stay quiet, let her lead. He bookmarked 3 articles but never finished reading. Morning always came too fast, demanding usefulness over clarity. He stopped telling people the whole truth because the whole truth sounded like complaint. He built a social script for the mailbox and the office. She's going to therapy, we're working on it. The plural felt noble and trapped at the same time. He noticed how nice he sounded. He noticed, too, how being nice bent his spine. On Tuesdays at 4, he timed dinner so it would be ready when she returned. Sometimes her answers about therapy were brave, detailed, alive. Sometimes they were just 3 words. It was fine. He wanted to be her harbor. Instead, he felt like the harbor's maintenance crew, patching cracks, sweeping floors, keeping lights on with no ships in sight. He created little rituals to soothe the not knowing, a glass of water on her nightstand, a folded blanket on the couch corner. He stopped expecting the version of her who once sang to the radio. He settled instead for the version who could answer a yes or no question without tears. When he spoke to himself, it was in metaphors he rehearsed like prayers. This is a tunnel with a light, not a system with no switch. This is weather, not climate. This is a season, not a sentence. He whispered them on his commute, repeated them in the elevator, carried them into the doorway, ready to deploy. He needed them every day. He believed that if he just tried harder, he would get his wife back. He ironed shirts to distract his mind. He checked smoke alarm batteries because control was its own kind of prayer. He sorted the junk drawer because order felt like mercy. He did not notice that trying harder had become the machine consuming him. He did not notice how small he had made himself to fit inside its gears. One night, rinsing plates, he caught his reflection in the dark window. He looked like a man underwater, performing chores with perfect form but no breath. He shut off the tap and listened to the refrigerator's hum. In that soft, electric thrum, he heard it clearly for the first time. He could not build both of them with his hands. He dried the plates, stacked them in the cabinet, and turned off the light as though ending a shift. Tomorrow, he would repeat the pattern. Tomorrow, he would try again. By spring, Tuesdays at 4 had become a metronome, the rest of their lives arranged around that single tick. Therapy in, silence out. The vocabulary of their marriage shrank to what could fit on a whiteboard: groceries, cape, reminder. Mark began to anticipate criticism the way sailors read weather. He wiped the counter before she could sigh at the crumbs. He ran the dishwasher early so it would not growl during her nap. He paid the electric bill a week ahead because last month's late notice had felt like a verdict on his character. He preempted trouble with extra work and called it love. Date nights disappeared. At first he had tried, reservations made, shirts bought, lines rehearsed in the mirror. Each attempt ended in a headache, a wave of fatigue, or the phrase maybe next week. Eventually he stopped asking. The absence of hope hurt less than its repeated collapse. Touch became awkward, sanded smooth by apologies. A kiss landed like paperwork. A hand on her shoulder turned into a question he had to answer alone. Emily drifted between bed and couch, scrolling through the lives of strangers who were always renovating or vacationing. Her eyes glazed as if the screen contained the only air she could breathe. "I should be better by now," she whispered once, and Mark hated the sentence. It gave failure a clock. He started hiding his own clocks, timing pasta by taste, timing days by chores instead of sunlight. At night, when sleep refused him, he counted tasks instead of sheep. He stopped telling anyone how lonely he was. The words felt disloyal to a person who had not chosen her suffering. Weeks passed without laughter. It was as though joy were a muscle and his had atrophied in the dark. He became careful, then joyless, then merely efficient. Lists replaced desires. Meals were cooked in batches. Shirts folded the same way every time. From the outside, efficiency looked like competence. Up close, it looked like a man who had forgotten how to want. The vows he once spoke with pride now felt like a contract he was breaking even by imagining leaving. Duty had a moral glow that disguised its corrosion. Co-workers praised his devotion, and each compliment carried a flicker of pride followed by a wave of nausea. The more he sacrificed, the more he felt entitled to a payoff that never arrived. Shame followed close behind for even wanting one. He told himself that yearning made him small, not realizing that never yearning at all was erasing him. Life acquired a script. "How are you two?" "We're working on it." The words slid easily, as though saying them were progress. At night he avoided mirrors because his reflection no longer looked like a man, it looked like a report. The apartment became a curated museum, tidy but hollow, meant to prove a life was being maintained. He lined the spice jars in alphabetical order, realizing with quiet despair that he was arranging things that would never feed them. On Emily's good days, she named small wins. "I showered before noon. I answered emails." Mark nodded, clapped softly, relieved in a way that faded too quickly. On bad days, she cataloged her failures. "I'm useless. I'm wasting your time." His replies were polished into reflex. "It isn't your fault. We'll find a way." They were true, but truth without oxygen does not keep a fire alive. He tried to summon old memories like proof of life. Their first road trip, her fearless singing, the peaches they bought from a farm stand where the clerk wrote their names on the bag like a blessing. Back then, getting lost together felt like a map to the future. Now he used navigation apps for everything and still arrived late to himself. Memory, he discovered, was a poor shelter. It kept out storms but not emptiness. When he let himself imagine leaving, the thought came like an alarm he could not silence. He fought it with better words: perseverance, loyalty, promise. He gave those words all his iron, never noticing the rust. He told himself marriages had survived worse, forgetting that survival is not the same as life. Breath held too long ceases to be proof of lungs and becomes proof of fear. One evening, he reached for Emily's hand on the couch. She let him hold it for a moment, then slipped away without looking at him, as if the touch belonged to an earlier version of the day. He stared at the space she left behind and felt something old and kind in him go quiet. Out of that silence rose a sentence, clear as a church bell but trapped at his teeth. "I am married to a ghost." Dr. Carter's office sat on the third floor of a brick building that smelled faintly of rain and old paper. The waiting room carried 2 plants that refused to die and a basket of dog-eared magazines promising how to live your best life. On the first Tuesday, Emily went alone. On the second, Mark drove her and circled the block, a delivery van with nothing to deliver. By the third, she returned with words that sounded as though they had survived peer review: clinical, careful, impossible to ignore. "The marriage itself may be the maintaining factor in my depression." The phrase was precise, delivered softly, but it detonated in Mark's chest. He heard accusation in every syllable, as if all his sacrifices were suddenly catalogued as evidence against him. His mind scrambled into courtroom logic. Exhibit A, the second job I never quit. Exhibit B, the birthdays I made happen. Exhibit C, the nights I listened until listening hollowed me out. He did the cruelest math: hours, years, ounces of himself poured into a cup that never filled, and the conclusion still wrote itself: you might be the problem. "I don't think Dr. Carter meant it like that," Emily said, palms up, voice careful. "He thinks the system we built is keeping me stuck. The roles, the caretaking, the way I stopped trying because you're so good at saving." "I can be worse at saving," Mark said, half a joke, half an offer he despised even as it left his mouth. "What if we redraw the system? New rules, timers, chore lists, you take back things I've been carrying." "I think I need time away," she interrupted, steady but trembling. "Space to reset. 3 months, I could stay with Mom, keep seeing Dr. Carter. Fewer calls, at least at first, so I can hear myself." The words tipped the room on its side. Mark spiraled. He apologized for harms he could not name. He searched her eyes for proof he was not a monster. He begged for some version of the plan where their address stayed the same. He offered compromises like bandages. He would sleep on the couch. He would only visit her mother's on Sundays. He would speak less, touch less, need less. With a flash of humiliation, he realized he was bargaining against his own life. Emily remained calm, almost tender. "I'm not leaving to punish you. I'm leaving because I don't know how to be a person here. Not yet." Her voice landed like a clinical chart note, dry, damning, difficult to refute. They packed in silence that carried weight. Mark folded sweaters into perfect squares, as though geometry might undo the fracture. Emily slid books into a canvas tote, pausing over the chipped mug from their first road trip, the hand-painted peach. "I'll take this," she murmured, and he felt absurdly grateful to be chosen for anything. He tried one final compromise. "What if we test it here? Same roof, separate rooms. You take the bedroom, I'll take the couch. We set alarms for conversations. We pretend we're roommates who like each other. I need the leaving part," she said, eyes wet but resolute. "If I stay, I'll fall back into the same gravity." She wrote a list what she would take when she would call, what not to expect. She asked for fewer texts at night. She asked him not to check in with her mother unless it was about logistics. "It's not that I don't care," she whispered. "It's that I can't hear anything under the sound of us." When she lifted the last box, Mark saw their history reduced to objects. A blanket, half a spice rack, that silly mug. He wanted to say something cinematic, something absolving. Instead, he said the truest, smallest thing he had: "Be safe." She hugged him with both arms, a teenage hug, apology without promise. He did not hold her longer than she allowed. She walked to the door, looked back once as if memorizing or double-checking. Then she closed it the way you close a sleeping child's door. Not a slam, not even a click. Sound left the apartment with her. Shape, too. The good shoebox was suddenly a diagram with missing labels. The bed became a rectangle with history. The couch became a riverbank where nothing would land. Mark stood in the hallway, stupid with the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Outside, a neighbor laughed. A bus hissed. Inside, his own heart thudded like a machine he had forgotten to turn off. He sat at the table, palms flat against the wood, conducting an inventory of blame that stretched across seasons. Two truths wrestled endlessly inside him. He had done everything he knew how to do, and he had also built a system that trapped them both. He wanted absolution. He reached instead for a glass of water. His phone lit up. A text from Lisa. "Do you want me to come over?" He typed yes, then deleted it. He didn't want an audience for this particular fall. He replied later, maybe. Then he stood, straightened the spice jars he had alphabetized, and hated himself for craving order when what he needed was relief. Release bubbled up in him, an emotion he dared not name. What kind of husband feels lighter when his wife leaves to get better? He had been taught to love without exit ramps, to endure until endurance itself became the proof of devotion. He recognized the teaching, but he did not yet know how to unlearn it. In the sink, one bowl waited. A neat metaphor. He washed it, dried it, stacked it where it belonged. He turned off the kitchen light and studied the new architecture of the dark. He did not cry, not yet. He stared at the door she had just closed and tested a sentence in the privacy of his skull. "This is what treason feels like when treason is relief." He swallowed it like medicine and walked to the bedroom, suddenly too wide for one man's sleep. The first month alone became a choreography of apology, performed on a stage lit only by the glow of a phone screen. Mark woke to the light on his nightstand and fell asleep with the device still in his palm, as if the right words might vibrate him awake when they arrived. He drafted messages the way others cooked, measuring, tasting, discarding entire versions when the seasoning felt wrong. "I'm sorry I pressured you when I was only tired. I'm sorry I went quiet when I was only empty. I'm sorry I didn't rescue you from storms I couldn't name." He pressed send on messages that sounded like confessions, then followed them with arguments that read like defense briefs. His thumbs ached. His throat did too. Emily replied sometimes, "Thank you for understanding. I'm trying to think clearly. I need space to hear myself." Her periods landed like full stops to the life they once shared. She made no promises of destination, only a process that required him to wait outside the door of her becoming. He offered compromises like flowers through a mail slot. "What if we try a new couples counselor? What if we set a check-in call on Sundays? But her gratitude never touched the offers themselves. The gap between them calcified into an instruction: do less, expect less, mean less. Hunger was the first to leave him. Meals became afterthoughts. He ate 2 bites of cereal at the sink, let the milk go warm, and called it enough. The clothes that once fit after gym sessions now hung off his frame as though his body were an apartment sublet to a stranger. Coffee replaced sleep. At 3 a.m., he stared at the clock like it was a program he couldn't turn off. Each hour he failed to sleep becoming another debt owed to morning. Work, once a sanctuary of competence, betrayed him. Numbers blurred until invoices bled into spreadsheets. He sent one twice, forgot a vendor call entirely. When his boss asked if everything was okay at home, Mark smiled thinly and said, "Yes, just a rough patch," as if the word patch could hold the weight of a canyon. He stayed late to fix mistakes, then drove home through streets that felt too wide for one person. He parked, sat in the dark, unwilling to open the door to the louder silence inside. His mother counseled patience. "Marriage is seasons," she said over the phone. "Some winters are longer than others." His father sent an old photo of a camping trip, 8-year-old Mark grinning gap-toothed, fierce in his small jaw. Tom texted beer emojis, then stopped when Mark never answered. Finally, Tom sent, "You good?" Mark replied, busy. The chorus of advice frightened him almost as much as the silence between. Those who loved him urged waiting, strangers on the internet shouted run. Both sounded like verdicts with sentences he still had to serve. Shame arrived like weather. It clung to his clothes, fogged his mirrors. In the shower, he rehearsed lines he would never speak. "I failed my wife. I became a warden with a wedding band. I mistook surrender for love." Then he turned off the water and forgot why he had spoken them at all. He searched for an angle that would make him better than this, a version of himself who could have kept the house warm, the bed soft, the appointments steady. That man lived in a neighborhood Mark could no longer afford. When he thought of Emily, he tried to picture her not as a diagnosis, but as the woman he once loved. He saw her in the kitchen during their first spring, hair up, barefoot, singing off-key. He saw her in bed last winter, eyes open but elsewhere, sadness thickening the air until the molecules themselves seemed rearranged. Late one night, he wrote her an email titled simply Us. In it, he confessed his love, promised to fight for their vows, and apologized to everyone he had ever been. Her reply came the next afternoon. "Thank you for sharing. I'm still not ready to talk about next steps. I hope you can take care of yourself right now." The kindness hurt worse than cruelty would have. It left him with no villain, only the ache of being unnecessary. He began a reply and stopped halfway. There was nothing left to say that didn't make him smaller. At the end of the second week, he tried to jog, remembering he was once a man who ran on Saturdays. Half a mile in, his chest burned, his calves knotted. His mind refused. He sat on a curb and watched a father teach his child to ride a bike in a parking lot across the street. The boy wobbled, the father steadied him, and the scene felt like a parable written in a language Mark couldn't read. At home, the fridge offered only a single lemon, a wilted spring roll, and the sound of hunger gnawing at his pride. Then came the thought that frightened him most. It did not roar. It slipped in like a draft under a door. "If this is the rest of my life, I don't want it." The sentence landed heavy as a wall. He did not run from it. He did not break it down. He simply stood inside its shadow, shaking. In desperation, he dialed Lisa. "I'm not okay," he said when she answered. The words were jagged but simple. He braced for questions. What he got instead were keys. 30 minutes later, she was on his living room floor, surrounded by unopened mail and an overflowing laundry basket. She brought soup and a patience that created space without demanding it be filled. She listened as he recited his faults like symptoms, and she did not flinch. "You don't have to be noble to survive," she told him gently. "You just have to survive." He tried to argue. He mumbled about vows, about duty, about being the kind of man who once said for worse without knowing how bad worse could be. Lisa shook her head. "You can be a good man and still be a man in a burning building who uses the exit." The words landed harder than comfort. They landed like permission. That night, Mark sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his reflection in the dark window. He looked like a widower whose wife had forgotten to die, a man bereaved without the dignity of mourning. He let that truth register, then set his alarm anyway. Lisa's words echoed in him like a light left on in a hallway. He turned off his phone and for once did not clutch it like a lifeline. He stared at the ceiling and whispered into the quiet, "I am not okay." The house did not break. The house did not bless him. It merely held. And for the first time, he allowed the truth to stay. The second month alone arrived quietly, but this time the silence did not immediately crush him. The apartment, once hostile, began to answer back in small ways. When Mark wiped the counter, it stayed clean. The sink no longer refilled itself with plates he hadn't touched. The quiet, which had been a weight, slowly became breathable air. One morning, he played an old vinyl from college. The soft scratch of the needle filled the kitchen, reminding him that his history didn't begin with suffering. He poured coffee, sat down, and tasted it while it was still hot. The absence of accusation in the room felt almost like luxury. He began to run again. The first mile was a negotiation with lungs and doubt. The second was a truce. By the third, sweat mapped his ribs and the noise of the day fell away like loose change. When he returned, the rooms no longer accused him of leaving. They welcomed him back without judgment. Meals became rituals instead of chores. He cooked for one and ate while the food was still warm. He lit a candle at dinner, not for romance but for proof that he could choose softness without needing permission. For the first time in months, he texted Tom, beer, and he went. The bar was loud and ordinary, a reminder that ordinariness itself could be holy. Tom asked how he was. Mark told the truth. "I am better. I am not cured. I am building." Tom clinked his glass against Mark's, a small ceremony for two men who did not know how to say thank you for not disappearing. Cleaning the hall closet, he found a box of forgotten artifacts, concert wristbands, postcards, the mug from their first road trip. He held it, then set it on a high shelf, not as a shrine, not as an open wound, but as a boundary. He flipped through old photos and let the memories arrive without turning them into evidence. He did not delete. He did not dramatize. He practiced the middle. On a Saturday morning, he walked to the park with a notebook in his pocket. Sitting on a bench, he wrote a list he had not allowed himself to write in years. "I want decent sleep. I want a Saturday without laundry stacks. I want to grill a steak my dad would brag about. I want to see the ocean before the year ends. I want a life that is not a waiting room." The page filled with verbs. He was startled by how long it had been since he admitted how much he wanted. Women noticed him now. A barista remembered his name, asked if he was training for something. A woman in a red scarf smiled when their dogs tangled leashes outside the park gate. He noticed being noticed, filed it under proof of life. He did not flirt back, not because of loyalty, but because for the first time he enjoyed his own company. He bought new running shoes with bright laces, replaced a dead bulb and watched the room expand. Changed the sheets, discovering that rest was different from collapse. He stopped checking his phone every 10 minutes. Emily's messages arrived occasionally, therapy updates, polite small talk, reminders to take care. He answered kindly but briefly. He no longer wrote essays begging for verdicts. He trimmed the plants, threw away brittle leaves, and resisted the urge to dramatize. Lisa dropped by with takeout and a movie. She sprawled on the couch like she had always belonged there. She didn't ask for summaries, didn't demand hope on a deadline. They cheered for fictional characters who solved problems by blowing things up instead of swallowing them. And then, for the first time in months, Mark laughed. The sound startled him, but this time it stayed. He scheduled therapy for himself. The office smelled of furniture, polish, and paper. He didn't know where to put his hands. He told his story in fragments, words like duty, numb, caretaker, blame. The therapist asked a question that landed gently and still cut deep. "When did you stop being allowed to want things?" He left with homework, notice 3 times a day when you choose. At first it felt small, but then he noticed. He chose to run in the rain. He chose fruit he would actually eat. He chose to say no to an overtime shift and yes to a slow jog at dusk. One night he slept 8 uninterrupted hours. No nightmares, no 3 a.m. Post-mortems of arguments that never changed. He woke to laughter that startled even the kettle into whistling. He poured coffee, opened the window, and let the cold strip of morning air remind him of newness. He placed a sticky note on the fridge. "You are allowed to build a life from scratch." The apartment did not look bigger, but he finally occupied it. He noticed how many choices had once been built around absence: quiet steps, soft doors, a body folded small to take up less space. That morning he stood barefoot in the kitchen and took up space on purpose. There was no applause, no witness, but there was peace, unremarkable, immense. The third month had only just begun when Mark's phone rang. Evening had settled into its quiet rituals, music humming low, the scent of garlic softening in the pan, his own presence filling the room without apology. For the first time in years, silence did not sting. He almost let the call go unanswered. But the number was familiar, and his body reached for the phone before his mind could resist. Emily's voice arrived fractured, tangled in sobs. She could barely catch her breath as words tumbled out in pieces. "I made a mistake, Mark. I let an idea become a sentence. Doctor, Carter never told me to leave. I told myself that. I panicked. I thought distance would save me, but it only hollowed me out. I miss you. I miss us. Please don't give up on me. I still love you." Her desperation clawed at him, dragging open wounds he had only just begun to scar over. The kitchen blurred as his chest clenched with something dangerously close to hope. Reflex whispered to forgive, to rescue, to say come home. Images rushed back, their vacations, her laugh at the breakfast table, the silly mug she carried out the door. Memory flooded him like a drug he knew too well. But then, like a stone dropped in still water, his new life interrupted. The quiet mornings when he laughed at nothing but the absurd fact of surviving. The beer with Tom where he told the truth without flinching. The sticky note on the fridge that read you are allowed to build a life from scratch. The runs in the rain, the therapy sessions that asked him what he wanted, the candle-lit dinners he made for himself simply because he could. All of it rose, steady and undeniable. His voice surprised even him, steady, clear, unshaking. "Emily, I'm done." The silence on the line was raw, stretched thin by disbelief. He continued before doubt could find a foothold. "Something broke the day you walked out and blamed the air we breathed. You turned us into the illness instead of admitting you were lost. And I can't unknow the relief I felt when you were gone. I'll send you the divorce papers. I need a life that isn't just triage. I need a life where I can breathe." Her sobs sharpened into wails, but he did not bend. He ended the call before her desperation could erode the fragile wall he had built. The moment the line went dead, he collapsed onto the couch, pressing his palms against his face. What tore from him was not just grief. It was grief braided with liberation. He had expected to feel monstrous for refusing her, but instead he felt honest. The truth sat heavier than guilt, but lighter than chains. For the first time, he understood that no could be a kind of love letter, not to her, but to himself, to the man he was becoming, to the life he had already started to live without her. That night, he sat in the dim light of the apartment that had saved him, letting the quiet stretch around him. For once, the silence did not accuse. It crowned him. News has a way of leaking through walls. What was meant to be a private phone call between Mark and Emily quickly sprouted legs, walked across family lines, and returned to him in voices not his own. His mother was the first to weigh in, her voice warm but insistent. To her, forgiveness was less a choice than a reflex, a muscle trained by pews and decades of habit. "Marriages have survived worse, Mark," she said, citing neighbors and cousins who had stumbled but rebuilt. Each story felt rehearsed, drafted to remind him that quitting meant weakness. Then came Emily's mother, her tone softer but heavy, guilt and hope woven into every word. She reminded him of the vows he had spoken before family and friends, promises she insisted were not so easily broken. Soon, a cousin texted a Bible verse urging patience, endurance, unconditional love. The message stung less like faith and more like an assignment, as though self-preservation were a crime. Mark listened. He nodded. And when the calls ended, he sat in his kitchen feeling accused. It wasn't just Emily who made him feel like the villain. Now even his own blood suggested his refusal was cruelty, his freedom selfishness. Every voice tightened the rope around his chest. Only two voices cut through the noise. Lisa, steady as always, said what no one else dared. You don't owe your 20s to a hypothesis. You gave everything you had and the experiment failed. That's not on you. And Tom, blunt as ever, wasted no breath. If she wants back in, she can knock for a long damn time. You don't have to open the door just because she's crying on the porch. Their words grounded him, but doubt still lingered like an itch. He hated being cast as the villain in other people's retellings of his story. Yet the thought of returning to that bed, that house, that silence, of drowning in duty again was unbearable. He knew the difference now between sacrifice and erasure. So he set a rule, not for Emily, not for his family, but for himself. No big decisions for 1 week. He would meet Emily once, in daylight, in public, to close this chapter face to face. He would be kind, but he would not bargain away his future. He wrote the rule on a yellow sticky note and pressed it to the fridge door. A square of paper turned into a spell. And this time, he meant to keep it. They met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where people came to read more than to talk. The smell of roasted beans and faint vanilla lingered in the air, heavy but comforting. Mark arrived early and chose a seat with his back to the window, unsure if he wanted to watch the door when she walked in. When Emily appeared, her steps carried hesitation instead of certainty. She looked smaller, older, her hair pulled loosely, her shoulders curved as if bracing for impact. But when her eyes lifted, they were still the same eyes he had once fallen for, and the recognition ached like an old scar. The first minutes were clumsy. Weather, traffic, the coffee menu, banal filler meant to delay the surgery that waited underneath. Then Mark drew a slow breath, steadying himself. For years he had swallowed truths like stones. Now one by one he let them roll out. His voice was calm, not cruel, almost clinical. He spoke of being turned into a caretaker without consent. The endless nights of cooking, cleaning, managing the weight of 2 lives alone. He described the 1,000 small humiliations, eating dinners that felt like obligations, walking on eggshells around silence heavier than shouting, sleeping on the far edge of the bed as if intimacy were forbidden. He chose his words with precision. Sentences began with "I felt," then "I need," then finally "I will no longer." Each phrase was less a complaint than a declaration of sovereignty, a reminder that his life was no longer a waiting room for her choices. Emily listened without interruption. Her tears came in quiet waves, smudging her makeup until she looked raw, almost unguarded. When she finally spoke, it was not defense but confession. She admitted her shame openly. She confessed that his devotion had become her cushion, softening consequences, numbing urgency, allowing her to drift instead of return. She admitted that leaving was not courage but avoidance, that her so-called reset had been nothing more than rehearsal for abandonment. Her voice cracked on the apology. For the first time, her words carried no conditions, no excuses, just surrender. The air between them thickened as if honesty itself had weight. Mark studied her. For a brief second, he glimpsed the woman he had once believed in, the girl who sang off-key on road trips, who turned their cramped apartment into a sanctuary with little more than laughter. But recognition was not the same as trust. He said so aloud with a firmness that startled even himself. Emily nodded, her tears sliding into silence. Leaning forward, Mark lowered his voice. It was steady, resolute. He told her plainly that he would not sentence either of them to the worst version of forever. If another chapter of their story was ever to exist, it would not be his ink. It would be hers to buy, hers to spill, hers to earn. His part was done. For the first time since she left, Emily had no reply. Her hands folded in front of her, trembling slightly, as though even words had abandoned her. Mark rose, placed cash on the table, and wished her peace. Not as a husband, not even as a friend, but as someone closing a book he no longer needed to reread. He walked out into the cool air, lighter than he expected. Behind him, the cafe swallowed her silence whole. Their next meeting wasn't in the cafe. Mark chose a park instead, wide lawns, strollers rolling by, students stretched out on the grass with headphones, a place too open for shadows, too public for theatrics. Emily was already there, waiting under a tree. She looked as though she were bracing for judgment. Mark didn't waste words. He had spent too many nights drowning in them. Now he spoke plainly, each sentence shaped like a stone. If there was to be any future, it could not resemble the past. There would be conditions, 7 of them precise and unbending. Not punishments, not revenge, but scaffolding, a framework. 1, she would hold a part-time job with standards of attendance and presentation. No excuses, no disappearances into endless sleep. A paycheck, however small, would mean showing up. 2, she would join him at the gym 3 times a week. Not as his patient, not as a project, but as a partner sweating beside him. Movement as proof that momentum was possible. 3, while she stayed at her parents' home, she would contribute daily, chores, errands, meals, without being begged or reminded. 4, they would date once a week in public. No screens, no cancellations, intention, not inertia. 5, they would enter couples counseling with a new provider. No recycling old scripts, no weaponizing half-truths. 6, she would choose a new therapist for herself, committing to full honesty without editing the story to suit her comfort. 7, if prescribed medication, she would take it consistently and transparently. Side effects could be addressed, but silence could not. Only after months of proof, he said, would reconciliation even be considered. His voice did not shake. Each condition landed with the weight of something immovable. Emily listened without flinching. For once, she did not argue fairness or tone. She nodded after each condition, tallying debts she had long known were due. When he finished, she asked just one question: "When do I start?" Mark felt something unexpected rise in his chest, not triumph, not revenge, steadiness. He told her the word that surprised him most: now. The air shifted between them. He realized he was no longer begging her to meet him halfway. He was setting the terms for his own survival. For years, love had meant surrender. Now, love, if it could exist again, would mean boundaries. He walked away from the park with sunlight slicing through the trees. He carried no illusion that 7 rules could repair what had shattered. But he carried something better. The certainty that, for the first time, he was negotiating not for her return, but for his life. 72 hours after the ultimatum, small but undeniable facts began to stack like stones. At her parents' house, Emily washed dishes before they cooled, folded laundry while it was still warm, ran errands before anyone remembered they needed doing. She texted Mark screenshots of job applications, cover letters, and finally a confirmation email for an interview at a clinic. When the day came, she arrived early, dressed in a navy blazer and neat flats, a woman prepared to be seen. At the gym, she stumbled. Her lungs burned on the treadmill, sweat dampened her collar. In the past, she would have quit after 10 minutes, inventing a migraine or muscle cramp. This time, she finished the session, shaky but proud. Later, instead of long apologies, she texted Mark a photo of her to-do list: laundry folded, groceries bought, therapy scheduled, with the caption, "Day 1 done." Dr. Carter, sensing the toxicity of history, referred her to a colleague for individual therapy. Emily kept the appointment. She even told Mark afterward not to seek credit but as proof that she had not abandoned the plan. Mark noticed. He was cautious, almost reluctant, but he noticed. He gave compliments sparingly, tethered to action. "Good work at the gym," he said, not "I'm glad we're back on track." When she thanked him for patience, he corrected her gently. "This isn't about patience anymore. It's about proof." He refused to fold her back into his daily rhythm. He kept his apartment as sanctuary, his counters and quiet evenings preserved as a reminder of what peace could feel like. Their weekly dates ended at 9 o'clock sharp. No late-night drift into routine, no pretending they had rewound the clock. He remembered too well how caretaking had turned into trance. He refused trance. Progress was jagged. One day she missed a workout and spiraled, sobbing into the phone that she had already failed him, failed herself, failed everyone. Mark listened, steady but unsparing. Then he told her the words he wished someone had told him years ago: "Missing is not failing, hiding is failing." The next morning, Emily arrived early at the gym. She jogged slower but longer. She finished without apology, only a nod. Mark didn't smile, not fully, but inside a quiet line was drawn. For the first time in years, she was carrying her share of the weight. Whether it was too late, that answer remained unwritten. Weeks began to stack into something that almost looked like a routine, though Mark refused to call it healing. Every Wednesday evening, they sat across from each other in couples counseling. Their new counselor, Dr. Patel, had one unbreakable rule: no one could narrate the other person's mind. When Emily started a sentence with, "You must have thought," Dr. Patel cut her off. When Mark began, "She only left because," the counselor raised her hand. Each of them was required to speak from "I," not "you." It felt slow, like learning to walk on a fractured bone, but it kept the ground from cracking beneath them. Emily practiced naming her spirals earlier. Instead of letting silence swell until it drowned them both, she tried to say, "I feel it starting. I need air." Sometimes she left the room and came back calmer. Sometimes she texted Mark afterward instead of unloading on him directly. For the first time, her pain was not automatically his to manage. Mark learned a discipline too, leaving when conversations circled like vultures. He said, "I don't want to loop, let's pause." He walked away, drank water, breathed. The old Mark would have stayed, exhausting himself in endless reassurance. The new Mark understood that stepping back was not abandonment, it was boundary. Their dates were tentative, fragile: dinner at a quiet bistro, a Saturday walk in the park, a matinee where they sat close but not quite touching. At times, it was almost lovely, the flicker of Emily's laugh, the familiar tilt of her head when she looked up surprised. But minefields were everywhere. A song from their first road trip, a question about last Thanksgiving, the sight of another couple holding hands without hesitation. Both of them flinched more often than they smiled. Mark refused to measure progress by moods. Instead, he tracked data like a scientist: how many therapy sessions she attended, how many days she got out of bed without prompting, how many chores she completed without collapsing, how many conversations ended without blame. He no longer asked if love was alive, he observed whether effort was present. And somewhere along the way, he realized a shift had occurred. He was no longer trying to earn love by erasing himself. He was evaluating whether love could exist again on terms that didn't destroy him. That distinction was everything. Emily noticed. She saw that he was not begging for affection, not bending himself into the shape of her stability. She did not punish him for it. Instead, she leaned into the challenge, as though she understood that probation was not cruelty, it was clarity. For the first time in years, she was building a self that did not rely on his rescue, and Mark, watching, allowed himself to respect it without making it everything. He would not let her progress erase the past, nor let the past erase her progress. For once, he held both truths in his hands at the same time. And it felt, if not safe, then at least real. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening during one of their check-ins. Not a fight, not a dramatic ambush, just the routine space they had carved out to measure progress over tea. Mark asked the question he had learned to ask carefully. "Is there anything else I should know? Anything unspoken that could undercut the work we're doing?" Emily hesitated, and Mark had already learned that hesitation was a flare. She exhaled, eyes down. "While I was living at my mother's, I joined an online support group. Most of it was harmless, but there was someone. Owen. At first, just late-night messages, sympathy in paragraphs. He listened in a way I thought I needed." Her hands trembled as she slid her phone across the table. Mark read the texts. Lines glowing in neat bubbles, shared loneliness, midnight confessions, fragments of fantasy. "If only we'd met sooner, you deserve someone who sees you." She insisted nothing physical had happened, but the timestamps cut like knives. The overlap was undeniable. Those same nights he had been begging for crumbs of attention. She had been awake, giving sentences to someone else. Emily called it starvation. She said she was desperate for validation and chose the cafeteria instead of the hard work of rebuilding. She apologized, not through weeping, but with a steady voice, as though she knew the damage was real but survivable. And then, with eyes brimming, she asked the question she feared most. "Does this ruin everything?" Mark surprised himself. He did not rage. He did not perform wounded nobility. Instead, his voice was even almost quiet. Cheating begins where honesty ends, and in that sense, this counts. The words landed like a gavel. Emily flinched but did not argue. She nodded, tears falling silently. Mark continued, his voice steady. I will not compete with a phantom. I will not share my life with a man who exists only in curated sentences and midnight promises. If this marriage has a chance, transparency is no longer optional. It is the air itself. Without protest, Emily unlocked her phone, blocked Owen in front of him, and typed a final message that was blunt and unromantic. I cannot continue this. I need to repair my marriage. Do not contact me again. She pressed send, deleted the thread, and then did something Mark did not expect. She handed him every password, every login, every corner of her digital life. Mark scrolled briefly, not to punish, not to save her power, but to confirm. He did not want to be a warden. He only needed to know whether the line he had drawn was real. And in that moment it was. He sat back, weary but clear-eyed. Trust would not be rebuilt overnight. But for the first time, this moment felt less like theater and more like the fragile beginning of truth. Stories never stay private for long. What happened with Owen, what Emily confessed, and what Mark demanded soon leaked into the echo chamber of family. Whispers grew legs, versions multiplied. Emily's relatives painted her as a sinner on her knees, begging for grace. Mark's side muttered that he sounded paranoid, cruel, obsessed for auditing her phone. Both versions twisted the truth, but distortions always travel faster than reality. Mark listened once, twice, then stopped. He refused to live inside narratives written by others. Instead, he acted. He drafted an email, polite, sharp, unmistakable, and invited both families to a single group call. No triangulation, no whispers in corners, one space, one time, his words. The call was not theatrical. He didn't shout, didn't beg for pity. He was precise, almost clinical. He laid out the facts, the 7 non-negotiables, the plan they were following, the timeline they had committed to. He did not soften the truth. He said aloud that Emily had betrayed emotional boundaries with Owen and that she chose transparency to rebuild trust. He explained how reconciliation would be measured, how it could succeed, or how it could end. When someone interrupted with, "But marriage is forgiveness," or, "You can't heal if you keep tallying sins," Mark answered with a single sentence that silenced the noise. "This will be the last group discussion about our marriage." The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand. Boundaries are not threats. Boundaries are fences, and fences are what allow gardens to grow. After the call, Emily sat with her phone in her lap, shaken. Her hands trembled, but her eyes did not avoid his. "I feel embarrassed," she whispered, humiliated, but also lighter. The weight she had carried, that Mark was somehow the villain, was gone. He had spoken truth into a space where no one could rewrite it. Mark did not gloat. He did not twist the knife. He only nodded, calm, as though clarity itself was enough revenge. For years he had been miscast in her story, as villain, as savior, as caretaker. Now, for the first time, he stood only as himself. The days that followed were not dramatic, but they were real. They kept dating. They kept sweating through gym sessions. They maintained separate addresses. Promises were measured not in sweeping declarations, but in the daily currency of action. Emily noticed the shift. Desperation still lived in her, but she no longer made it his burden. And Mark noticed his own shift. Power, he realized, was not domination. Power was the ability to choose his role in the story. Stories never stay private for long. What happened with Owen, what Emily confessed, and what Mark demanded soon leaked into the echo chamber of family. Whispers grew legs, versions multiplied. Emily's relatives painted her as a sinner on her knees, begging for grace. Mark's side muttered that he sounded paranoid, cruel, obsessed for auditing her phone. Both versions twisted the truth, but distortions always travel faster than reality. Mark listened once, twice, then stopped. He refused to live inside narratives written by others. Instead, he acted. He drafted an email, polite, sharp, unmistakable, and invited both families to a single group call. No triangulation, no whispers in corners, one space, one time, his words. The call was not theatrical. He didn't shout, didn't beg for pity. He was precise, almost clinical. He laid out the facts, the 7 non-negotiables, the plan they were following, the timeline they had committed to. He did not soften the truth. He said aloud that Emily had betrayed emotional boundaries with Owen and that she chose transparency to rebuild trust. He explained how reconciliation would be measured, how it could succeed, or how it could end. When someone interrupted with, "But marriage is forgiveness," or "You can't heal if you keep tallying sins," Mark answered with a single sentence that silenced the noise. "This will be the last group discussion about our marriage." The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand. Boundaries are not threats. Boundaries are fences, and fences are what allow gardens to grow. After the call, Emily sat with her phone in her lap, shaken. Her hands trembled, but her eyes did not avoid his. "I feel embarrassed," she whispered, "humiliated, but also lighter." The weight she had carried, that Mark was somehow the villain, was gone. He had spoken truth into a space where no one could rewrite it. Mark did not gloat. He did not twist the knife. He only nodded, calm, as though clarity itself was enough revenge. For years he had been miscast in her story, as villain, as savior, as caretaker. Now, for the first time, he stood only as himself. The days that followed were not dramatic, but they were real. They kept dating. They kept sweating through gym sessions. They maintained separate addresses. Promises were measured not in sweeping declarations, but in the daily currency of action. Emily noticed the shift. Desperation still lived in her, but she no longer made it his burden. And Mark noticed his own shift. Power, he realized, was not domination. Power was the ability to choose his role in the story. And that is how the story of She Left Me Broken, then begged to return, My Revenge Was Freedom, comes to an end. It's a reminder that betrayal always carries a cost, and sometimes the most powerful revenge is not revenge at all. It's walking away stronger. What about you? If someone who once betrayed you begged to return, would you open the door or close it forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us here on Cheating Stories 7 for more drama, betrayal, and the lessons that follow. Until next time, take care of your heart and remember, freedom can be the sweetest justice of all.